Andrew Zago is partner and founder of Zago Architecture. The firm has completed projects in the US and Korea. Notable among the firm's projects are the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit, the Fine Venture Office Tower, and a design studio facility for Cornell University's Sibley School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. Zago Architecture was selected to participate in a workshop and exhibition at MoMA titled Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream. Zago has been in and out of SciArc since 1986 and is now the Visual Studies Coordinator. He has taught at the University of Illinois Chicago, Cornell University, the University of Michigan, UCLA, Ohio State University, and from 2003 to 2007, he was the founding director of the Master of Architecture program at the City College of New York. His work has been exhibited in Berlin, New York, Detroit, Princeton, and Los Angeles. Andrew Zago is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome and has been a recipient of both an Academy Award in Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and a letter and a fellowship grant from the United States Artists Organization.
And was just selected to participate in the next American Pavilion of the Venice Biennale.
Oh, wow.
So was Florencia and Jackie separately.
So Peter Bloom.
Yeah.
And the personal introduction that I wrote for Zago is written through Zago's perspective, what I think Zago's perspective would be. The poem is called Dinner with Zago. While you sit down to dinner, life as you know it could end. Thought you were exploring the new, but it was only a trend. Been there before, so my projects don't sit, nor stand, nor lean. What's seen can't be unseen, which can be obscene. There are unvisited tombs where past architecture rests. Dare to leave it behind so you can experiment and test? I don't adopt, civilize, or reign. I'm just a practitioner with a name. Zago, I must stop the conversation and say, you adopt, civilize, and you reign. A catalyst to teaching and debate, architecture has become unsure of its fate. Misregistered, misaligned, or misshaped, we will never finish dinner at this rate. Andrew, I appreciate you taking the time to sit down.
Thank you.
The first question is, what do you think was your first architectural project?
Well, I know what my first one was. It was my third semester of graduate school in the studio by Bahram Sherdel, and we had worked on a small theater for MIT. And that was a reasonably important project at Harvard. It was, it caused a lot of trouble. It was wildly not a building at a time where that didn't happen. And I consider that, like in my body of work, to be my first project.
How has that project shifted your thinking or started your thinking towards architectural practice?
I don't think it was the project so much as meeting the person who would then later I'd be in partnership with, Bahram Sherdel, and the things that, I basically went from starting off in architecture and realizing I had absolutely probably made the wrong decision because the field made absolutely no sense to me. This was in the heyday of postmodernism, and decided to stick it out one more semester, and then encountering someone, seeing his work and some of the things that we were doing, where I understood that there was a different dimension to architecture and that it was something that I could do and should do.
You refer to the book Shape of Time by George Kugler.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that interests you about it?
Well, I mean, I should say I'm not alone in it. It's a book that's been influential in a lot of fields, both creative and scholarly. It's contentious also. The notion that there is a logic to the form of things, and that this logic is not personal, but actually is a kind of human endeavor and a human undertaking, and it's advanced in individual steps, but that the project is larger than that. And I think that is one of those books that made me understand that the project of architecture is not a personal project.
Could you maybe differentiate between how you think about shape, form, and weak form?
Well, the shape and form is a tricky one, and I won't be able to give a good answer, but it was always a clear understanding on my part that architecture, when it's not thought about or looked at very carefully, tends to produce shapes, things that say, here's some empty real estate, and I'm going to put something in there, and it's going to stand there where things had been empty. Whereas form suggests something more complicated than that. Form would suggest something that may well be clearly outlined as a shape is, but is generative of a space as opposed to something. Shape would be something that you would put into space, and form is something that in part produces that space. I think that's the difference. It changed over the years. I think in part it was when someone like Greg Lynn was working on projects that I didn't care for at all. A lot of that sort of the earlier blob work, and takes on the name form, even though I would put a lot of that stuff into the shape category. And then lots and lots of people that come out of that or were influenced by that and start imagining that really complicated, curvy digital things as form. And so that word got taken up to mean that, which is not what it means. Often, the more complicated it gets, the more it asserts itself as a shape and actually eludes form. And I think it was in response to that Bob Somel then takes up shape as the underdog and valorizes it in his piece 12 Reasons to Get Back into Shape. So it's intentionally taking the dumb thud that shape makes when it hits the ground and saying that was a corrective to form. So I sort of buy Bob's argument, but I think it was needed more because of the confusion over the nature of form. The dumb example I always give is with like the human body, like a weightlifter who works on like their physique, and you say they're in good shape, you mean their actual outline, as opposed to an athlete like maybe a diver, you know? When you say they're in good form, you're actually describing a kind of motion in space and how they cut how they cut through the air. So that would be the kind of crude difference between shape and form.
You are very finessed when it comes to approaching lines and curves. You're very careful through the transition of when curves are introduced to the projects. Could you maybe elaborate on that?
Well, it's not, at some point, it became so easy to not be disciplined about curvature, to simply introduce any kind of curvature willy-nilly, and we had software that was more than happy to kind of follow along with it and make that happen. It seemed like that just very quickly became devoid of any kind of possibility of an impact. And so I would just never go down that path of the complicated approximations of splines as being somehow an advance over other kinds of curvature. So I don't know if I want to sit here and categorize it, but we certainly go into complex curvature with infrequently and with great care. I mean, there was a chair in particular we worked on, which is rather complicated, but that was generated from a very precise set of intersections and other kinds of parameters.
Talking about that chair project, actually, your drawings are very minimal in number of lines. Very minimal in number of lines versus they still have the complexity of the information that new drawings that have multiple layers of lines have.
Yeah.
So maybe can you talk about the complexity of information versus the complexity of what's visibly present?
No, I guess, you know, I mean, the chair in particular, the curved one, I mean, it was really, the interest was well, there's a few things, but at its core, in terms of, let's say, its relative simplicity, it was kind of straightforward. It was to imagine what would be the least amount of matter that could suggest an entire volume, an entire sort of full volume with virtually no matter. And so that's what we worked on very hard with that, both the curvature as well as the diameter of the curvature, to suggest almost like a kind of, I mean, it's not literally like a charcoal drawing on paper, neither in how it was thought of or how it was executed, but it shares some of those qualities where the push and pull of pressure on that paper suggests various kinds of depths and volumes, even though very little of it is there. So it is, you know, it does have certain drawing qualities that come into a kind of three-dimensionality.
We hear a lot about the intersection of architecture and culture. How do you view that intersection, and how do you create that intersection?
You know, it's not, I don't know, that's, I wouldn't be able to give any kind of good or clear answer to that, other than architecture is absolutely, it's not even in relationship to, it's a fundamental component of culture. It has it often plays a background role in culture compared to other, you know, explicit things that you spend time looking at and watching and listening to. But it's so pervasive that I think it becomes an important component of culture. So I think there is that, and I think this is a fundamental part of the quality of a work of architecture, has to do with the extent to which one can understand that the project is participating in a larger cultural project and is somehow in its form, in its diagram, in its execution, resonant with a larger cultural project. I think you can see works that do that and works that don't.
Moving back to the references, you used to mention Rothko a lot, still do.
Yep.
How has he influenced your approach to architecture?
Well, it's difficult. It's been up until this last few months, we didn't ever know how to build it, and we kind of figured it out. So that was a nice breakthrough. There's a lot of aspects to it. I mean, it's an incredible painter, and there was a very important show a number of years ago at the Whitney that was one of these transformative experiences to see this show of Rothko paintings, and I think a lot of other people were equally moved by it. Aside from the color, the atmospherics, the scale, all of these things that we can talk about and that others have talked about eloquently, the one thing that I noticed about Rothko, which was maybe the most important lesson for me, is that it appears, if you look at it casually or you look at it in reproductions, that the mature work is about rectangles. And what you realize when you stand in front of one is that it's not really about that at all. They're of a scale when you stand there, that everything that's in your center of your field of vision is more or less nothing. It's a kind of atmosphere, and that the entire content of the painting happens actually between the edge of the rectangle and the frame. And so it's actually that space between those two things is exactly where a Rothko painting happens. It's a very strange experience, and this is what I understood in seeing this show. When you're looking at it, well, one thing I realized was the history of, let's say, Western painting is various things done, various ways of structuring space within the cone of vision. And what Rothko did was actually worked in a different territory. The painting was actually structured in peripheral vision. And that's, I think, a lot of its effect and a lot of its interest. And so that, to me, I mean, my interest in things like the sectional object, where something fills up a space and becomes so large that you can't see it, you can only understand the periphery of it, comes directly out of those paintings.
You've spoken against object-oriented ontology in the past, saying that your alternative to it would be I object. Could you elaborate?
No, I don't have, look, I'm neither an expert on it, nor do I have, nor am I against it. In my perusal of the literature, there's nothing in it that makes me, it may be my limited understanding, but there's nothing in it that either suggests a challenge or a new direction to architecture. I'm all for my colleagues' enthusiasm for new philosophy. I applaud them. I don't understand why this becomes an architectural movement, especially because object in architecture has a very specific and frankly problematic history that in other words, our discipline has its own discussion of objects and its own status and interrogation and valorization and critique of objects. I don't think it's an impoverished discussion that we suddenly need some other philosophical discussion to enter. And it's like when you have discussions of space, you look at like the OED or something like that, and it's like, I don't know, 2 pages of description of what space is, or when we're talking about geometry or politics or any of these other fields that have very, very profound and developed meanings in other fields. And often we look at this and feel we must be stupid because look at how philosophers discuss space, look at how scientists discuss color. And I'm opposed to that. I think it's really important to look at these things, and occasionally there's points of contact and crossover. But I think we have our own discipline and our own discussion, and it's more, if not substantial, it's certainly more directly relevant and instrumental to what we do in architecture than pining for some other sophisticated version of the discourse. We're often, the only thing that overlaps is coincident terminology. If you're talking about I don't know, if you're designing a car and you're an engineer and you meet someone who's doing bioengineering, you are both engineers, and perhaps someday in the future there's a car that has blood transfusions, but in the meantime you're happening to use the same word. It's not that there is oh my God, one field is suddenly impoverished because it's not doing what the other one is.
Talking about the object and then talking about your interest in urbanism and architecture, would it be fair to note that your earlier projects were more expansive and your newer projects are much more introverted?
Yes and no. We know there were times where I just finished working on a project in Korea with some other architects, which was quite, if not expansive, scattered. And in fact, for a studio that I'm about to undertake here, I'm looking at the very first urban project I did, which was for downtown Los Angeles. I think it depends on the scale of things. I think I think it was a realization that there was a certain large-scale urbanism that doesn't quite make sense anymore in the world, and that the idea of architectural interventions that had urban resonance was a more effective, that the solution to urbanism was architecture, and just try to figure out the scale of it. And so I think it tended to be more things like this rather than fields. But that varies. I mean, I'm just starting to revisit that problem actually.
Nearly 20 years ago, 2 decades ago, at an AA lecture, you stated that architecture has reduced its field of expertise down to the aesthetic shaping of volumes. Do you believe this is still the case today?
Not even. looking at the Cohn-Pedersen-Fox rewrap of the Peterson Automotive Museum, which is purportedly just that. It turns out the aesthetic shaping is something that many architects are not even capable of.
Could you maybe talk about the problems architects are facing today in more of a disciplinary effect on the way they're approaching practice?
I mean, it's difficult. I have a small practice. I always joke, you talk to people in very large firms and they'll talk about trends of, projects coming in and projects going out. In our office, a couple of projects means it's good, and we lose a couple of projects, there's an economic downturn. So it's not, I'm not a good person to speak about the field in general. The one thing I do feel, and this is something that I've talked about and have worked on explicitly, is trying to make a distinction between the discipline and the profession, and that the discipline is actually that portion of the field which is very small and is quite contentious as to trying to define who's in the discipline and who isn't. But that we could say more or less that there's architects that are committed to moving architectural forward as a cultural project, as an aesthetic project, as an intellectual project, and then others that don't. And I think this is, maybe it's always been the case. I think the important thing for us to realize and to acknowledge is that those that don't, even though they're the vast majority, they rely completely at some level on the advances put forward by those that roll up their sleeves and do it. So I think that's important. My only point is sort of, has two sides to it. One is that, and I don't know how this would ever happen, but I think somewhere the profession at large has to acknowledge, like the Peterson Automotive Museum, a firm that wrapped that skin according to a geometry and a sensibility and an aesthetic that has absolutely nothing to do with what their firm is about and has lots to do with what other innovative architects have done. And so they could at least say thank you. And then on the other hand, I think our discipline, those that work in the discipline, need to understand the potential efficacy of our work and our diagrams when it intersects the world. In other words, that there's a politics to the disciplinary work of architecture when it enters the world. So I do think there's a moment now, certainly in the U.S., where we have to be much more confident in that assertion. We worked very hard at that when we were asked to do a large redo of a failed subdivision in the Los Angeles area for the Museum of Modern Art, our foreclosed project. We were looking exactly on taking diagrams. You had mentioned misregistration, which was something that we were interested in as a disciplinary problem. And then we were asked to look at the ecology, economics, et cetera, of a foreclosed property, a major foreclosed property. And so we went in there with an architectural diagram, and we had our economists, our ecologists, our infrastructure people work from the architectural diagram out, not like, oh, you must know more than us, tell us how we handle this problem, and we'll make it look like something. So.
You said that you would like to believe that you are working on one project, and you worry that might not be the case. What do you believe is your specific strand or topic that you're working on?
I don't think I worry about that anymore. I must have been mistaken. I don't think it's one project, but and it wouldn't be something that I could say it's this or it's that. I think the project is the work, and if I could translate that into words, I suppose I would be a writer instead of an architect. But I think you do find, it goes back to this question. When you were asking about the Kubler and the shape of time, and the idea that it's not personal. I think at some point you enter the field, you gain a certain understanding of the field and the moment that you're in, and a certain understanding of what you can do and what your insights are. And you try to think through how you can apply those to this general problem and help things advance. That's one's project, I think. And so, if you have a relatively narrow set of insights, then, that's what you work on. And I suppose if you have a broader set of insights, you can work on wider things. So everyone's, somewhere in the middle. I work on different things, and then we worked on a lot of things this summer, and then someone was pulling out some things out of archive, and they pulled out some model from like 20 years ago, and we held it up next to this thing we had thought was brand spanking new, and realized that while in many ways it is, one could make a direct link to something that we had stopped working on 20 years ago. The dissipation of matter, let's say, the installation I had done here at SciArc and other things that I was doing at the time.
Talking about matter, I want to talk to you about the phenomenon of transparency, or literal transparency. What role do these two things play in the way you approach your work?
I don't think so much. There is something at the core of that essay on transparency, which really has to do with fundamental modernist pedagogy for visual acuity and sophistication, which comes out of a kind of Gestalt understanding of form, but I think it predates that, which is to understand that it goes back to this idea of form and shape, that one can set up relationships of things to imply series of complex spatial fields and possibilities within it, even though it literally is just one thing. Right? So, I've always, going back to when I was an undergraduate and being in a lecture course of Rudolf Arnheim, and understanding that there was this kind of complexity of how one understands form and visual phenomenon. So it is not about a particular work or a particular approach, but to me it's always been important to understand that form itself is a complex human achievement, that's really that's our medium that we work in architecture.
There was an interesting thing that you spoke about before about form, and you talked about, my model is not one of choreography, but a math problem, that you could actually go through it.
Wait, I said that?
Yeah.
When did I say that?
For your installation at SciArc, I think.
Oh, I see. It's not choreography.
It's not one of choreography, but a math problem, that you could actually go through it.
I don't remember. Was that in the lecture?
I think so.
I can't remember the context. You have to understand. It's like when I lecture, I always do it with virtually no notes, and it all comes to me as I'm saying it, and then I forget what I said. So, and now it's all recorded, so I guess I said that.
You talk about abstraction being exhausted, and that it's important to bring back literal figuration into architecture. Do you feel that the discipline has moved on from the abstract, or do we need to go back and finesse it?
No, I think you use two different terms there that I separate completely, which is abstraction and the abstract. I believe that my only interest is in the abstract, absolutely the only. It's just what that is, that pure and unadulterated sensation that a work provides without its, that one doesn't get a work, one experiences a work. That's a kind of abstract state. The problem of the 20th century was to unload, let's say, a certain kind of baggage of representation by stripping down qualities, more and more qualities. That's the process of abstraction. So to get at abstract by having less and less features. And there's classic examples, and you can even read Mondrian's writing on this, where he finally realized you couldn't have any curve. You'd always have a human body. You couldn't ever have green. It would always become landscape. One by one, all of these things were removed. I think we just went through a process where that ran its course, and that kind of abstraction became its own kind of legibility. And so I think I am not interested in legibility per se, but I think one has to skate across the surface of things to find different ways to get at abstract.
Misregistration is, in a way, something that uniquely belongs to you, something that you brought to the discourse. How did you come about it? It might be a question that we can't get a specific answer to it, but it would be interesting to get.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't. There's a long attempt of assaults on the status of objects in my work, and so you go through one by one and imagine what are the categorical qualities of objects: clear outline, solid material, legible geometries, etc. And I've gone through and I've tried to work on these at various times. And then one of them was just the realization that you can see almost everywhere that material change occurs where geometry changes. And there's almost any kind of architecture you look at, you can find those two things happening. And so we just got interested in what would happen if that wasn't the case. And so, looking at bad printing and misregistration, it turns out it's relatively easy to do it in 2D. There is no exact way of doing it 3D, so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out basically how to just allow a relaxation of, so that in an object, classically understood, it's packed in there a whole series of qualities. And we've tried in various ways to kind of loosen and let some of those qualities slip. And some misregistration would have grown out of those efforts.
One more question and
Sure.
then we'll wrap up. Can you talk maybe about the role of color? You've been very finessed in the way you've approached color and very, in a way, accurate in the way you've applied it.
Well, it's funny, architects are often famously chromophobic, to borrow a term, and I am not, and maybe this goes back to my fine arts training. Vince Castenacci, who was someone that had worked with Cy Stillman and knew Joseph Albers and went through the whole the same basic color training that Bob Slutsky did, who wrote the transparency essay with Cullen Rowe. And so, there was a kind of understanding that like form, color also had its own discipline, that one needed to understand the possible effects and complexities of color and work that way. And so I don't know if it ever entered in as a theory, and I'm not sure I would ever call myself an expert at colorist, but I do have some background and competence in that, let me put it that way. And so when it comes down to it, I think just sometimes that occurs to me as a possible option, as opposed to not. Lately, over the last few months, I'm trying to imagine a more specific role for it. So I don't think I formed any kind of general argument for color in architecture, other than I think there's some fairly large unexplored areas for it in architecture, and I feel like, at least for us, this is actually the time to explore it.
I'd like to end on a phrase you've said that has completely changed my perception of my own thinking towards architecture, and that is the phrase productive misunderstanding. What have you productively misunderstood that you have now incorporated into your own discourse? and now you understand?
It's I mean, I'm glad you like that. I mean, the misregistration would be an example of that. It's fundamentally a 2D problem. If you say, oh, I think this is a 3D problem, it means you really don't understand what it is. But if you just sort of say, well, okay, in spite of the fact that that's a bad idea, could we actually let's just pretend like we misunderstand it and really thought someone was talking about something three-dimensional. What could we actually make out of that? So it's really, I suppose it's things are approached in a certain way for good reasons, and we can understand those reasons and we can act that way. Doing it not that way and doing it wrong is not good. That's bad. There's no reason. But sometimes if one tries to be very strategic about it and tries to intentionally make an error about something and actually pursue it and make something out of it, I think it's a way of describing, at least in a kind of contemporary way, a tool for opening up areas of working that wouldn't occur to one otherwise. So there's certain things you just don't do because there's certain ways you just don't work, or certain mistakes you just aren't willing to make. And it's really good to have all of that expertise, but occasionally it becomes a kind of box, or a kind of cage. And it's very difficult to not simply operate within that sort of closed arena. And so sometimes one has to intentionally misunderstand things, but try to make it productive.
André Zago is one of the biggest wealth of knowledge. His influence is unmistakable. He is the X ingredient to architectural maturity. He is very generous with his knowledge and giving and his teaching. However, he never takes any credit for it and never wants to be viewed as influential or credits himself for all that he achieved. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and I will take credit for everything. Thank you.